Thank you so much for your invitation and for you being here. So I'm very happy to follow my colleagues today because hopefully I will manage to build on what our two last speakers said today, because I'm going to problematize empathy within the working environment. Now I would like to have a full screen and I keep forgetting how to get there, despite this thing happens often. Okay. So today I'm going to present a synthesis of two books I've been working on in these past years. Empathy and Ethics, which is an edited book I put together with my colleague Magnus Englander, and The Ethics of Love, which is a monograph on which I worked in this last year. Now my computer is completely stuck, so you will not.
Okay, yeah. So excuse me, perhaps you can press the.
There you are. Just take a little moment. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You have to treat them well. Okay, so it's a synthesis, as I was saying, of this book, an edited book exactly on empathy and ethics, and these other books, The Ethics of Love. So today I'm going to mix up these, the essence of these two books and ask mainly the question, how can we be better professionals? I mean, better teachers, better psychotherapists, clinicians in general, but even, I don't know, better merchants, better people in contact with each other. In The Ethics of Love, I reflected on this problem. Generally, they would say it's common sense to say, you know, if something is done out of love, even if its result comes off rough or weird, it's good because it's made out of love, so it arrives somehow. And I question this. I question this statement because I think we might do better than this. I think that as we train logic as a way for us to think better and better, we could train ethics as a way to act, to behave toward each other better. Both could be embodied, not just mental exercises, to understand how we can express caring, loving feelings for each other in effective ways. So, as it concerns the work of professionals, we are assisting to a trend in which the professional is at its best when it's completely detached from what's happening. So I'm a professional when I'm teaching to my students if there's none of me there, if I'm this thin layer of good behaviors and I'm conveying my knowledge to them. Clearly, if I use the example of a teacher, it's immediately self-evident how being a good teacher in this manner would not be effective. Nevertheless, in the daily world, we encounter professionals of any kind, a lawyer, I don't know, a doctor. This is a big problem in healthcare, who are asked to behave in this way. You are asked to be as formal as possible, as detached as possible, as not invested as possible in what they are doing. Now, from where does this come? So here I would like to question the form of professionalism we are assisting today and the form of empathy that this professionalism involves, because the form of empathy that is included in this package is an empathy trained to a number of sentences of polite, formal remarks that you have to say when you hear something. So, for example, in the case of a woman going to her gynecologist and giving the anamnesis of her situation, she might say that at some point she had a miscarriage, and the gynecologist is trained to say, yeah, I'm really sorry, and to end there and to move fast to the next topic. And this, especially if the woman is pregnant, is repeated over and over with all the visits she has to repeat with the different professionals throughout the pregnancy. So it's a form of empathy that does not warm us up. It's a form of empathy that costs time to the professionals and some kind of small repeated traumatic or cold experiences from the patient. So where does this come from? Here, with my colleague Magnus Englander and partly by myself in the book, we started from the natural attitude. We tried to see how in the history of philosophy, seen from Husserlian perspective, the natural attitude became the main foundation of what we call science. So what is, let's start from description of the natural attitude. What do we mean by it? In the natural attitude is where we find ourselves every day when we live our normal life. And the main characteristic of the natural attitude is its being acceptedness, meaning in the natural attitude, everything is as is. We don't need to question anything because we just live. We are human beings in the world and we interact with each other as human beings. In this natural attitude, we encounter reality and irreality together, meaning we encounter things that are objective, that are presented in front of us as normal. And of course, we also have subjective experiences. We also interact with things in a way that is unique and personal. Now, a problem that came to the surface with, according to Husserl, Galilei, and then became system with Descartes, and here I'm of course referring to the crisis, was that this natural attitude, what we encounter as objective and taken for granted in the natural attitude became objective. And we forgot that this objectivity, which we transformed in a number or in a form or in a symbol, in a token of any kind, was taken for granted and was not questioned. So the problem of the natural attitude in connection with the idealization is that our sense of self became naturalized into a model of self that was, again, ideal, given for granted, constructed. This is the word that Husserl uses in several places. What we found in a natural attitude is a construction. This construction of meaning is, as Professor Inama was saying, the very last level of a refined process, a refined genetic process of constitution of meanings. Nevertheless, when we make science, when we transform science in technology, meaning when we cut the natural attitude from the process of questioning, from the process of what is here, from the awareness that we are taking something for granted, then we make this token an ideal, a form, something perfect that becomes the guidal model. So here I cited some passages of Husserl that I think they are absolutely applicable still today. So the conceptual model of idealization is the fundament of the whole method of natural sciences, the method of inventing exact theories and formulae, and also of reapplying them within the praxis which takes place in the world of actual experiences. So the criticism that Husserl moves to Galilei was that he transformed the natural mode of existence of natura, of what we find in the natural world, in models, in formulae, in the geometrical language. Galilei, according to Husserl's reading says that nature must speak a language that we can understand. And this language is the language of geometry, is the language of mathematics, is the language of something that is objective, universal, and somehow understandable for us. So nature and our attitude inside nature became the number, became the formula, became the mathematization of existence, which again, there might be nothing wrong with this mathematization as far as we question the number. If the number becomes the final word on which our meaning depends, on which our constitution of sense and values and embodied feeling of our life depends, is not enough, because this number is still needs to be reconducted to our first lived experience. So what happened when we apply this idealization, which clearly, as you understood at this point, has nothing to do with creating ideals, but it's almost Platonic sense. I mean, creating universal archetypes based on what we find in nature. So what happens when idealization is applied on empathy? It happens that empathy as well becomes a model, becomes a formula. And we see that, I don't know, again, with the example I was giving you beforehand with the woman who goes to her appointments, medical appointments, or it happens when, I don't know, you are politely when you politely interact with others that are empathizing with you according to a script that is clearly handed out to them. It's something that it can be immediately perceived. So this comes from a professionalization of empathy, for which empathy becomes something described by simulations activated by mirror neurons, or explicit simulation through cognitive processes, meaning empathy is seen as an ideal formula, an ideal, a universal matrix that can be applied just by paying attention to how our brain, not even paying attention, is our brain doing it for us. We don't even have to be there in the empathetic act. Our neurons already put in practice this mimic or this simulation or this cognitive process. What happens when empathy is interpreted in this way? Other human beings are taken for granted. So the curiosity we were talking about before is very difficult to gain because these other human beings are taken for granted. So the woman who had the miscarriage, she's, we have to be sorry for her because clearly she's sad. We might even not saying anything. I don't say here that we have to invest always with every encounter our presence. The problem of the naturalization of empathy is that we stop listening completely what the other person is saying to us. We do it first as professionals because this is how we should be, and slowly this eats up our personal life because our work is a 24/7 deal almost. We work from morning at 8 if we're lucky until evening at 5 again if we're lucky. So this behavior for which we take for granted that these human beings are there independent of us and they are experiencing what they are supposed to experience, create again a great distance, a great void between human beings. Exactly the opposite to what empathy generally does or is supposed to do. I don't know what linguistic frame to use exactly. To continue the path of Husserl's critics to Galilei and the history of philosophy, as Husserl says, instead of being the liberator from our idols, and again here by idols we mean these universal empty tokens behind which we hide the universal knowledge of nature, of the world, created a mathematization of nature for which nature and the world is this entity independent of us. We have no responsibility toward that, nor engagement, and our scientific and universal knowledge about this is an abstract construct of nature. So as scientists, accordingly as scientists and then as professionals, we have to pretend that we are not involved in the human product. That's what makes us more objective, that the numbers we produce are not in any case connected with our subjective interests, and life flows independent of us. We are somehow above everything. And there was an interesting case of suicidal and depressed doctors, especially in the field of medicine, having to take this stance, having to pretend to be so far away, becomes dangerous also for the person itself, because it gets more and more detached from its own body, from its own feelings, instincts, emotions. And from there, it's hard to gain the living energy that anyone's need to keep going. Nevertheless, they cannot even say that they are depressed, because otherwise their job, their profession would be questioned, and they might even risk to lose the license. This was an important case that came to the surface, and hopefully by now we are taking a different stance. But still, the professional structure is the main problem, how we conceive the professional to be. The professional has to ignore this important intentional relationship between subject and life world, which is exactly the model that Professor Enama was presenting before. We are in the life world, we are embodied subjects that generate meanings out of this passive and active relationship with the life world. So the human being as a construction or an idealization or an abstraction can even be, but we cannot consider this abstraction and idealization as detached from the body, from the whole current of instincts, feelings, sensations. In one word, I would say practical intentionality. I mean, all the intentions that have an outlet in the practical life of the individual. Hence, in this science, if we conceive science as detached from everything, science becomes becomes a technology. And this is the famous criticism that was moved to technology by Walter Benjamin, Heidegger, and so on. So science become titemi in Greek, something that reproduces at best, while and measures, creates numbers, generates numbers, while for Husserl, measure is an inventio, meaning it's something that we find as interconnected with the human being. The measurement that we assist in this kind of science is objectivation, is reification. Transforming something that is alive into a sacred number that has to be objective and detached from human life. How does this connect with ethics? Tragically, I would say, because if empathy it becomes this refined technique of making as if possible, of creating formulae through which we think we connect with others, ethics becomes a guideline of ethical principles, or at best an instrument through which we avoid being sued, for example. If we look at Husserl ethics again, we have a different model, especially Husserl's late ethics from the volume 42 of Husserl. We have a model of ethics that is based on practical intentionality. I mean, on a series of intentionalities that are radicated in our body, in our feelings. Being able to be an ethical human beings means being able to reflect responsibly on what we intend, what we feel, on especially, again, in this later Husserl, for example, the love values, which are different from the objective values. The love values are those values around which we organize our life, and they are those who allows us to perceive ourselves and the other as close to each other. So this model of ethics would conflict completely with the model of professional ethics that unfortunately is becoming more and more popular for professional ethical choices, in which you are truly ethical if you can abstract yourself from your loving feelings, from your subjective values, and this kind of ethics becomes clearly devoid of human depth, intentions. That's why when I wrote about bioethics and phenomenology, at some point I raised the problem: do we really want a bioethics that is completely detached from emotions? Because sometimes to understand certain cases, we have to invest ourselves as human beings to understand how another person might feel. So in this transition, we moved from a form of professionalism that was based on pro fateri, cioè being able to be responsible for others, to speak morally for others because aware of our own responsibilities, our own moral order, and being capable of guiding somehow the people who rely and believe in this profession. So we moved from this kind of professionalism strongly based on a subjective, responsible moral order to a form of professionalism that is completely oriented by the Industrial Revolution, that is organized by the rapid growth of the natural science, the technology, and the need, the compel, the demand to provide for the individual needs of the human being. More the human being, Weber uses the expression homo economicus, who perceives the meaning of life as production, as being able to produce more and more work and accumulate wealth. Hence, this professional is an independent observer facing a reified patient. That's the thing. In objectifying ourselves, we objectify also the person we relate to. We create remoteness and distance on both sides. The moral values becomes the corporate, which is another problem, corporate values of the work industry we belong to, and exercising a profession in the society becomes avoiding to lose the allowance to exercise this profession, not getting sued or detach yourself from the human world. And it is something I already discussed. Here I give some references. Another big problem that we are facing, especially in the US, fortunately it's not something widespread everywhere, but is arriving, is that the technologization of empathy and professionalization is such that even the way in which we produce education and culture is objectified and goes the other way around. So education is what would fit the test, instead the other way around. We don't create the test based on how our children know things, how they develop knowledge, how they grow into the subject matter. But we create the test first, which is objective, detached from the world up there. And then we train our students to fit the test. as the World Health Organization remarked, we are facing soon an epidemic of suicides of kids in high school age, around from the 15 years old to 20, because we oblige young people to detach from their own interests, from their own life, in order to feel good when they can fit these empty models, which is clearly not successful. Again, we give for granted that realized young professionals should fit into this and that form, into this structure. Hence, empathy is a technique, is a trained act of imitation, which does not lead to improvement for the wealth of our society. Now, what's the proposal of a phenomenological empathy, a truly phenomenological empathy? Again, in the same way as Husserl's ethics is based on the volitional body, as he says in Husserl Material 4, and the intention of this volitional body, the same thing is for empathy. I mean, even when I say this, I cannot really understand, I'm creating that minimal pairing of bodily feelings that connect me with these other human beings. I recognize these other human beings as a human being similar to me, and I'm saying this I can't understand. Nevertheless, I'm there. Same thing with Shaler criticizing Lipp's account of empathy as imitation. Before you imitate something, you must first have been present to the expression you are imitating. So empathy is not, or it can also be this act of simulation, imitation, but there must be acknowledged something at the bottom of this imitation. Empathy is this, as here, as Shaler was saying, no, this is from Stein, is this act of perceiving the experience of a foreign consciousness. In the empathetic act, I am with the other person. I am present to the other person in this pairing act, which is the lowest law of synthesis that we find, for example, in Husserl's lectures of active and passive synthesis. I mean, the way in which matters come together is through this pairing act, in which we recognize the homogeneity, the similarities of what we are. And it's in a perceptive moment, it's something immediate. And through this, we can follow each other's expression, we can recognize each other as embodied presence. So maybe the doctor can even be trained to not necessarily say anything, but maybe taking a moment to be there, to follow what the other person is saying, or maybe not, and just leave it to an open script and give the doctor the possibility to be herself, himself at the moment. Maybe that might bring better results. So, one of the conclusions, possible conclusions I present here is that in professionalism, we might do better if we bring back empathy as this interpersonal understanding of the other, as an act, an ethical act of self-responsibility. So in that moment, I'm responding from myself for what I'm perceiving from the other. I'm not necessarily following ethical guidelines. Of course, I have to stay within these guidelines. This is the highest level that guarantees well-being and order within the society. But I do not arrive there without passing through me as a human being that considers itself as an I-we, as an intersubjective unit connected with others. Taking for granted the life of others, that the world exists, that things has to go in this way, has a huge price, because it alienates us from our lived experiences and alienates others from us. It creates this massive sense of loneliness, isolation that we live through this generation. I mean, I teach mostly in college, and it's hard, it's scaring. I also work as a philosophical counselor, and often I have to convince my clients to open up a bit, to talk to others, to believe in the possibility that if they share some of their experiences, of their real thoughts to others, they are not necessarily burdened, and they will not necessarily consider them as losers or failures and so on. So yeah, in analogy with his genetic theory of meaning, we have a big wealth in Husserl's ethics, because Husserl's ethics has a genetic potential, in the sense that the way in which he reasons on values and how these values allows us to see our emotions and to structure our feelings can help us to get closer to a view of the world as intersubjective, as subjective and objective at the same time, something that we experience subjectively and we perceive as general for everyone. As I was saying in the quotation I first cited in this presentation, is an ethics that in one word recognizes the relationality of our values, and the complexity of how these values bounce on each other. These values are not abstractions, are not constructions. There might be objective values as, I don't know, the respect for the state, the compliance for certain rules. But these subjective values are still those around which we organize our lives. And in these subjective values, we find the love values. And these love values are extremely complicated, because in these love values, we find our subjective, deeper feelings that are deeply intricated with subjective feelings of others. And so we always have to be minded of how these love values can organize our ethical life. Now, clearly, this cannot be immediately applied on a professional life, because when acting in a professional way, we have to follow absolutely a certain script, but we cannot let this script to take our whole life and let us believe that life, the correct one, the excellent one, the ethical one, is that script. That would be the failure of us as a society, I think. Maybe I'm closing with too much of a statement. Here are some references. We used to build a PowerPoint, and I stopped talking for now here. Thank you so much for listening.